Good afternoon. I'm Timandra Harkness. I'm hosting, chairing, facilitating. I'm in the middle of this session, which is called, we're going for the snappiest title of the afternoon, Fighting Fake News and False Facts with Evidence and Statistical Thinking. And if you can still say that by 11 o'clock tonight, you're not partying hard enough. I am a member of the Royal Statistical Society. I am barely a statistician, having scraped a degree through the kind offices of the Open University. I'm also a journalist and radio presenter, so I kind of straddle both sides, if you like, of this question. And in a sense, I think so do both of our speakers. Let me introduce them to you now. On my left, we have Peter Cunliffe-Jones, who founded Africa Check, which fact-checks across 4 African countries and is also part of a wider network of fact-checking organisations, and also worked for the AFP news agency for 25 years. So again, kind of straddles experience of journalism with fact-checking. And then on my right here, we have James Ball, who you may know as the author of Post-Truth, How Bullshit Conquered the World. And yes, we have checked that we're allowed to say that out loud at an RSS event. But he's now the global editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism after having been data editor of The Guardian. So in a sense, I guess maybe slightly moving in the opposite direction. So both of you are straddling this question, but moving in different ways. We have 50 minutes, well now 45 minutes. So what we're going to do is I'm going to monopolise them for a bit of conversation, but then I will make sure there's time to come out and get your questions and indeed opinions on something which I think is probably close to everybody's heart in different ways at the moment, but as people interested in statistics, data and evidence, possibly more yours than most people's. And I really wanted to start by throwing to both of you kind of a basic question, but one which I think might open up some bigger questions here, that fake news is a phrase we hear a lot, but what does it actually mean?
I think the one good development really in the last 12 months is that pretty much every official panel that's considered fake news as a problem has agreed they should retire the term. Because fake news, if you're Donald Trump, means anything that you dislike slightly. And fake news, if you're actually someone trying to research this, means an entirely fabricated piece of news. And if our problem was just stuff that was entirely fabricated, we would be in a much nicer world than we're in. What we tend to have is exaggerations, half-truths, hyper-partisan stuff where you've got a little kernel of truth in the middle with a lot of bad information around it. We essentially, at the moment, have a kind of toxic information ecosystem where we're all more or less passing around any number that looks like it agrees with us. And really, I can't say that for any given political issue, one side or the other is culpable. Go on, it's early, I'm going to have to use the word. Brexit, sorry. I cannot tell you in all good faith now that bad information or overhype or anything is the preserve of Leave or Remain. The campaigns is a different question. But we have got to a point where essentially we have this toxic system where there is so much more going on to it, and also so many more causes than the media or than politicians or than anything else, that I wish we could worry about fake news. That would be lovely.
So Peter, does this chime with the international picture? Is fake news still a useful term anywhere?
It's a very simple term, and it's used in an awful lot for talks and for meetings and so on, at which everybody then agrees the term shouldn't be used. But so in a way, I think it's a terrible term for all the reasons that James explained, and it's used, as he says, and not just by President Trump, but by all sorts of more authoritarian governments around the world to justify attacks on media freedom and attempts to shut down debate. So in some ways, it's very negative. The counter side of that is that it has, by being simple, it has helped to engender a discussion around misinformation. And if it does that as a sort of shorthand for all the many different types of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, ways that content is either entirely fabricated, as James was saying, or mislabeled or what have you, then it's a positive thing. But I'm trying to sell it without actually much conviction.
Aren't you trying to do exactly what we often complain about, which is that you take something which you know to be false, but you think that's justified because of the larger truth of the whole debate?
No.
No, I'm glad you picked up, though, on the authoritarian regimes point, because that is something I wanted to ask about. I mean, slightly jumping forward maybe to one part of the debate of what we do about it. There are various governments, I think Malaysia is one of them, certainly Singapore, that have said, no, fake news is a terrible thing. This is awful. We must do something about it. We're going to pass a law against publishing fake news. And of course, in practice, when governments pass laws against publishing things, that doesn't always play out the way we might like. Is there anything else you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, so there are I'm an advisor to the International Fact-Checking Network, which is a group now of, there are 80 signatories to a code of principles that we've drawn up. It's for organizations that go from Australia to the US, from Argentina to Ukraine. Africa Check, the organization I worked with, is a member, and so on. They are sort of put together a database of more than 40 countries now that have provided or are trying to provide some form of regulatory or legislative response to misinformation. And a lot are obviously seizing the opportunity to close down debate that they don't like. So in Tanzania, criticism of, maybe this is the wrong audience to say that too, but so criticism of official statistics is a criminal offence. Which probably makes their lives in some ways quite simple, but obviously is a terrible thing for free public debate. And the greatest, and I've regularly gone to conferences where regulators sit and said there is a way that authorities can help to tackle, those in government can help to tackle misinformation, and it's by releasing good information, which is so one of the biggest problems that we see in places where Africa Check works, where across Asia, in Latin America, is a dearth of reliable, easily available official statistics and data on all sorts of issues. But yeah, there is a very heavy-handed approach in some cases in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Egypt, and in Tanzania and elsewhere, and it's very problematic.
Quick show of hands then. Who thinks that criticising official statistics ought to be a criminal offence? Okay, a couple of people. No, but seriously though, so James, I mean, I'm guessing that you also have some disquiet about the idea of governments legislating what's fake news and what isn't, but what can be done about it if not government saying this publishing untruths is a terrible thing and must be stopped?
I mean, we would have very significant problems with the UK government legislating against fake news for the moment, because the current Prime Minister was actually sacked for writing it from the Times. So, you know, could we backdate the prosecutions? I think the media and actually to an extent experts have a problem on this, because the thing that this tends to come down to is tell a better story. And I'm going to use Brexit again, sorry, but the 2016 campaign was fought largely on a narrative of we send the EU £350 million a week, let's spend it on the NHS instead. 2 sentences, easy story, sounds like quite a lot of money, I get it. The counter-narrative that came from, not just from the Remain campaign, you can't pin this on them, this came from lots of people like me who thought I was doing lots of very clever fact-checking, etc. And to that 2-sentence narrative, we said, well, you know, actually this 350 million a week figure is really quite unfair, because actually we get a rebate that Margaret Thatcher negotiated. Now, that depends slightly on the relative GDP growth of the UK versus the EU 27, but it does tend to average out at about 93 million a week, and so we don't actually send that over. So it's a lot fairer to talk about 253 million a week. But, we also get structural funds, common agricultural funds, regional investment funds, and they tend to average out at about 78 million a year. So really, we should be talking a lot more about sending the EU 175 million a week. At which point, any normal human being has, fled the room. But then I've got to go, and actually, that 175 million a week really isn't something that we would have if we did it, because we would actually have much lower future growth if we left. And so by 2030 or so, we wouldn't be looking at 175 million a week more, because we'd have got richer much more slowly than we would otherwise in the hypothecated world where we stay in the EU. And so we would actually be looking at maybe being 300 million a week worse off. At which point, they've gone and cast their vote for leave. And so we all got caught up on thinking we were brilliant, taking apart this stuff, fact-checking it, really doing some responsible journalism. And most of what a normal person would hear was Remain and like the experts say we send 175 million a week to the EU. Vote Leave say it's 350 million a week. It's probably somewhere in the middle. That sounds like a lot of money. And we got caught on their narrative. We didn't tell a true story that beat the false one. We just kept trying to make the false one really boring, and then got surprised that we lost. It ties into the broad problem of narrative. That sort of slogan for Leave, take back control, turns out Dominic Cummings meant it for him, not for Parliament, but still a really good slogan. I have covered Brexit every day for the last 3 years. God, three and a bit now. Please, just let me die. I honestly cannot recall right now what Remain's slogan was. Stronger together, something like that? Not even got a verb. And so we're not telling better stories. We're not getting out there and using something. We're quibbling, we're sounding technocratic, and then we're wondering why people who tell stories win. I think it's because we're in our comfort zone when we just pick apart a narrative, when we just lean on the facts and the caveats and we complicate. And I think, my sort of challenge, especially to people in this room who play a job in working with the media or communicating to the public, is what's the true story that you can tell? What's the narratives that we can tell? And where can you go where people are? It's very easy to do something long and caveated and qualified that a lot of your peers will think, this is a really good, nuanced piece, or do something on a sort of fact-check, nerdy sort of niche bit that I love reading, but that will reach maybe 20,000 people. How do we tell true stories? How do we break through it and make that more interesting? Because otherwise we're sort of sitting, not changing, and sort of cursing the public for not liking us. And I don't think that's ever going to change anything, and I think, regulation certainly wouldn't.
Well, there's a couple of things you've thrown up there that I guess I'd like to pick up on maybe separately. I mean, although they are linked, one of them is how effective it is to simply pick up on a single fact and say, no, you're wrong. But perhaps the bigger question you've thrown up there is, can we, should we, and how do we separate matters of opinion from matters of fact? Because whether we should leave or remain is clearly a political question. And as you say, that becomes much more about narratives, about which issues are salient in people's minds. I mean, personally, I don't know a single Leave voter who was remotely interested in the bus. My impression was it was Remain voters and nerds who were really interested in the figure. But that's a political question, and you can check facts within it, which can be useful. But inevitably, who brings those facts is going to colour people's perception of how trustworthy they are. Now, of course, you can extrapolate that to other things. I mean, for example, the question of vaccination of particular groups of parents who don't want to vaccinate their children. Now, I mean, I may be biased here, but I think that's a much clearer factual case where the benefits to individual children as well as society of vaccination are pretty clear and well evidenced by science. Nevertheless, parents who choose not to vaccinate clearly don't feel that. And the question then is, how effective is it to simply give them lots of facts and lots of evidence? Because it doesn't seem to be, certainly in a developed Western scenario, it doesn't seem to be that effective to just keep saying, no, you're wrong, have some more facts.
Yeah.
So perhaps we put on one side for a moment the question of what's a matter of opinion and how do we separate, but come back to your slightly narrower point, which is if it's not effective to simply give people facts and evidence, then what is effective?
Yeah, I mean, we have an interesting thing, I think, in the evidence-based community in that we know the evidence suggests that evidence isn't very persuasive, if at all, but we still want to do that approach because we tend to like evidence, which there is either a paradox or something very meta going on there, and I haven't quite untangled it yet. But I think, there's often a desire to be right more than there's a desire to actually win sometimes or to convince people. I think we have to be cautious about exaggerating the danger. I think sort of in the UK and largely globally, we're looking at a more literate, more educated, more engaged population than we ever have. This is not a question of there was a golden age of 20 years ago or something. People we sort of know from social media, certainly in countries we've got data for, which tends to be Western Europe and America, are consuming more news from more sources than they used to. There's this sort of worrying thing of this, look around the world, this might be as good as it ever got, which you can find cheery if you want.
So far.
But we have this sort of situation of it feels like there's a risk to the pool of agreed facts and the pool of agreed sources. And that's sort of where the danger lies. We've got this odd thing where information now, a lot of people get it through Facebook, get it through Twitter, etc. And the networks of trust don't work quite right for that. A lot of us trust our auntie or our uncle. We don't think they're gonna beat us up. If they feed us something, we don't think it's got to be poisoned. We would probably trust them with a secret. Should we trust them to assess the medical evidence on whether a vaccine is safe or not? No. But we've got, unless they've got quite good qualifications in this, my aunties don't. But if they're sharing something, we often have that effect of a carryover of trust, that halo effect. And so we've gone from this sort of strictly broadcast model where people who hopefully were experts and had some qualification with broadcasting advice, to this sort of going back to the traditional kind of samizdat models. So we've got some issues of that, and we've got that coming at a time of increasing polarization on a lot of issues, and a natural erosion of the sort of old school, probably over-deferential model of trust. And so we've got this diminishing pool of facts that we trust. And to take issues that we're polarized on, the World Bank or the IFS or all sorts of institutions that once would have been uncontroversial and that's a fact and you use it as you wish. It's just now, if you don't like it, well, they're biased, aren't they? Well, they would say that. Research, while it's pharmaceutical funded. It's trying to get back to a culture of skepticism rather than the culture of cynicism that we're moving into is actually sort of a big move. And, the issue is I've done sort of 2 or 3 years of talks like this, and you always end up hitting a point where you say, what we need to teach is better statistical reasoning in schools, or what we need is critical thinking, and sure, fine, but if you say that we need to do something in schools, you're trusting a primary school teacher half an hour a week for half a term to fix one of the bigger problems in your society, and you're writing off everyone over the age of 10, which isn't ideal. But neither of those things, and I like both, by the way, neither of those things is going to fix the culture of cynicism, the culture of conspiracism that's moving in. And that's a sort of much bigger question than just the media.
So, Peter, what's going to work in your experience? Projects in schools, teaching better statistical thinking, more critical thinking?
Well, so in a way, as James suggests, what some people call the information disorder, isn't a simple problem, and therefore there isn't a simple solution. There isn't a single solution. It isn't that there's one thing that will work and forget all the others. I think people have got things wrong since there have been people. So people getting things wrong, people making misstatements, that's entirely normal and natural, not to be expected. Some things do matter. And so we were talking about, for example, Africa Check, the organization I worked with, held a workshop in Abuja, in the Nigerian capital, last September. And we set up a group of health editors from media across the country trying to surface examples of health misinformation. And some of the examples we find are exaggerating the health benefits of eating fruit. So they're pushing you to eat far more fruit than you actually need to in order to have health benefits. So it's misinformation. And another example that we found, which is quite horrific, was a claim that circulates in Nigerian society that if you want to cure what Nigerians called Apollo, which is conjunctivitis, you put diluted battery acid in your eye or in your child's eye, and these messages circulate on WhatsApp and in sort of peer-to-peer networks and so on. And I spoke to the president of the Nigerian Optometrist Association, and he said, yes, he personally sees about 3 or 4 patients a year who come in having blinded themselves or one of their children. So some matters and some doesn't. So the first thing is that if you want to try to tackle it, in a way, as James was saying, right, it's actually working. You have to work out what misunderstandings lead to negative social outcomes. And then part of that then goes to, right, so who is affected by that misunderstanding and who has a power to act on that misunderstanding? So if it's misinformation circulating around, for example, what vaccines do, that's something where you would look for a public health campaign. In Nigeria, in the early 2000s, there was a huge public health scare about polio vaccination. There was a lot of misinformation spread around it in 2002, 2003. There was a big UNICEF, WHO campaign, a polio vaccination campaign. Polio rates soared because of this, because the vaccination rates collapsed. Then in 2006, there was a huge public information campaign, and now Nigeria has been declared polio-free. So you can, at the level of mass misunderstanding of an issue, if you put enough effort into it, you can tackle that. But if you go to another example of health misinformation, it took an audience of one, in the case of Thabo Mbeki and his understanding of, from sort of reading quirky sites, quirky is a completely inadequate word, around HIV/AIDS, that has been estimated to have led to the early deaths of 300,000 people. So in order to tackle that, you actually need to direct your efforts at one individual, at one policymaker. So I think in order to tackle, that's a very long way to answer the question, but so I think there is public information type fact-checking work that does need, as James was saying, to focus both narrowly on certain individual facts, but also then more broadly on narratives. There's work done to try to stem the flow of misinformation, identifying where misinformation is coming from, getting a much better understanding than there's been before of where it's coming from and what are the routes, the channels by which it passes. I was saying when we talked earlier that in South Africa, for example, the police last year released crime statistics that were wrong. We found they were wrong. We went to the police. They corrected the statistics publicly. So you can work in some cases. It doesn't always work with everybody, and we can all think of people prominent public figures who don't correct when they say things that aren't true. But there are those that will. So you can try to tackle at the sort of the demand side of misinformation. You can try to tackle the supply as well. And then, yes, I do think that, so as part of that sort of a battery of initiatives, media literacy and work in schools. And there was a very good example from Uganda, where there was a trial that was done, a very well-run trial, showing if you work over I think a nine-lesson program with schools in Uganda, can you get children to understand and to identify health misinformation? And the trial showed a sort of strong, a very significant increase in their ability to do so. Will that in and of itself solve the problem? No. But if you do that wider range of things, I think you have a chance in tackling the problem.
I want to broaden out a question slightly. I mean, picking up rather on your point about it's a very wide problem in society, possibly about our relationship with truth generally and our acceptance that there can be a shared truth about important things. If this is a wider crisis, and yeah, without wanting to exaggerate it, I think you're right, there is no golden age, but I also think that perhaps our willingness to trust has become more partisan. I think you're,
I'm too much on the left and I need to be on the right.
I think it's when you move your head round. So I thought you just need to move your whole body round when you speak to us. Yeah, I mean, this is my impression, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's my impression that who we trust in terms of news and facts has become more partisan, and we are slightly more inclined to say, oh yes, well they would say that, wouldn't they? I'm going to trust my own trusted source. If that is the kind of nature of the problem, what can people like the people in this room who work every day with evidence and stats and facts and generally have a commitment to trying to bring those into the public and let the public use them to make better informed decisions, what can they do to make that connection between what they will do in their everyday jobs and how the general public inform themselves and make decisions?
I think part of it is to start trying to have conversations instead of trying to have lectures. And I think I'm quite anxious not to stereotype here in that I'm from a sort of northern English Leave voting area, working class family. You would not get it from the accent, I know. Type thing, you know, no one is a monolith. The North is not full of chippy, cheap racists. You know, despite what sort of half the kind of advertising in the South would have you think. People are just as complicated everywhere. But we have this quite bad habit of wanting to just tell people what they think or what they feel is wrong. And, you know, on a macro level, it might be. But we have a sort of narrative of the last sort of 15 years in the UK that is quite hard to miss. We are, in the long run, a traditionally quite low immigration country. And thanks to the way we and other Western EU countries sort of operated, we had an unexpectedly very high sort of period of immigration in the mid to late 2000s that absolutely, undoubtedly changed the social mix of quite a few areas. You know, shops changed, streets changed, people were undercut, there were lots of local effects. And there were shortages of places, etc., some of which actually were caused by the immigration. There was then a massive recession and financial crisis that coincided about exactly with that immigration boom. And that was then followed by the deliberate policy decisions of austerity, which have seen real incomes are still not back to their level beforehand, services were very heavily cut, etc. So if you have a link of, you know, Europe financial crisis, austerity, everything getting worse, life tricky for my kids, if you try to then turn around to people in some of these areas where their lives have not improved now in probably 15, 20 years and often got worse, and say immigration doesn't cause any problems and here's a graph that shows it, is it a surprise that they think you're an elitist Oxbridge bleep and ignore you? You know, it's a very difficult thing to ask people to ignore their lived experience and believe you instead. I think we've got quite, and none of this is to excuse the quite, you know, the horrifyingly high number of actual racists out there who no time for you. But like there is this habit where we want to sort of tell people, no, that if you look at the macro picture, this isn't true. And I know I'm caricaturing a bit here, but there is a lot of that. And how do we turn that into a conversation? How do we move that to actually maybe this would work better to make stuff better, like improve stuff for you? But a lot of it, people aren't going to start listening to Westminster about what makes you richer or poorer until it does make them richer or poorer. And a lot of this is actually about realigning people's incentives and sort of realigning people's pictures. Like, London's been quite, which is where I'm from, London has been quite shielded from a lot of what's happened, or nice middle-class London that I experience has been anyway. And so those sort of disconnects between, what people on TV say, what people in universities say, and what people live, I think is to an extent really quite real. And we shouldn't ignore the big macroeconomic picture and the sort of realities of people's lives under the kind of, well, okay, if we just present it better in the media, if we present it better in talks. We have to make it true for people's lived experience, which is probably not the task of people here. But I think we can at least acknowledge that, that subjective experience really does matter and doesn't come from nowhere.
Does this ring true, this gap between people's subjective individual experience and the overall factual figures that they see given to them as some kind of higher truth?
Yes, I mean, so one of the phrases that James used earlier was about the kernel of truth in an argument that is actually overall misleading. And if you don't acknowledge in the way that you're communicating the kernel of truth in a misleading claim or a misleading argument, a lot of the people that you are seeking to, whose understanding you're seeking to correct, will just dismiss what you're saying. And so quite a lot of fact-checking organizations are now trying to do is trying to build that into the sort of structured way that information is put out to say, there is this reason why you might believe X, and might do that on this basis. If you look at it in the broader picture, this is why that's a misleading picture. But I think that there's and so putting it into the national picture, I think there are other problems that you see in the case of in Africa, statistics agencies seek to follow internationally defined rules for how you measure things such as unemployment. And I know that, Africa Check regularly is asked to look at claims made by statistics agencies in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Senegal, South Africa, where we work, and says, so these are the figures that are presented, and this is done, we've looked at it, this is done according to internationally defined standards. But those standards are set on the basis of a West understanding of how society works in the West. So in Nigeria, I lived in Nigeria for 5 years. I never met anybody who was unemployed because there is no social safety net, there is no welfare state. So everybody works to some extent. And it might be that they walk up and down what are called go-slows in traffic jams, trying to sell something, but they wouldn't classify themselves as being unemployed. But so the way that those things are measured, and this was a point, we put out a report quite recently about a claim in Kenya that the official statistics in Kenya say 7.4% unemployment in Kenya, and everybody mocks this figure. And the head of the Director General of Statistics in Nigeria picked this up and said, look, we have exactly the same problem here. Overly strict international regulations of how you define unemployment are undermining our credibility in Nigeria. So I think there is perhaps room for discussion around not just how you nuance it within nuance the debate, which is obviously a very hard thing to do, as you were saying, in the way we use statistics within a country, but internationally, how it's done in a way that reflects, isn't trying to cheat and massage the figures, but does reflect the lived realities in those countries where there's no social safety net. There's obviously a different understanding of what unemployment is.
I do want to come out and give you some time to ask questions and give us your thoughts. But before that, there's one other thing that I'd like to throw at both of you, which is a phrase, in fact, I picked up from David Spiegelhalter, so comes with much more credibility than anything I could dream up myself. But he talked about something called white hat bias, where people who feel that they're morally in the right are apt to overlook untruths on their own side because they feel it's part of a greater truth. I mean, it's one I remember from some years ago, but it still keeps popping up as a zombie statistic that because of obesity, this generation is the first that will die before their parents, for which there's never been any evidence, but it refuses to go away. But I'm struck by it more recently with the coverage of the fires in the Amazon, where various headline facts have been paraded, like the Amazon provides either 20% or 10% of the world's oxygen, it's X% of the world's carbon.
How do people
the
think
fires
trees work?
are bigger than they've ever been in any year before, all of which have been fact-checked and debunked in media news stories, but nevertheless they continue to dominate the headlines. And I mean, this seems to me like a classic case of white hat bias, in that not only the organisations that have marshalled these figures, but also some of the news outlets are saying, yes, okay, the details are wrong, but the overall story is on the side of the angels. Are we a bit too lenient with stories that we feel are essentially on the right side, or that have the overall, are overall on the side of truth, even if some of the details are wrong? Would it help general trust if we were a bit stricter with things that we agree with? The phrase I'm thinking of actually is too good to check. And I've done this myself. There's a wonderful story that I have used as an example where an orchestra started to do blind auditions where the players played behind a screen and the number of women they employed went up. And I used this in a radio program, and apparently this is absolutely bogus and by no means proves anything because there was no control to compare it against. But I thought it was too good to check. So is that something that we need to, should we work harder at checking stuff that we like than stuff we don't like?
So I'm actually conflicted on this because it was at a NatSen event actually, and I got asked, well, how do we communicate as clearly and as strongly as people who we think are putting out dangerous narratives without compromising on the truth? And I kind of said, you don't. And why are you why? If something's got to give here, why is the being absolutely right on the detail sort of a higher moral good than sort of stopping actual bad real-world events? And it very obviously wasn't the answer he wanted to hear, and he wanted me to have some way that he could have a pithy one-sentence message that also contained 5 paragraphs of nuance, which, unless you can talk even faster than I can, you're not going to manage. I think, honestly, what we have to drop is the double standard. We either have to shrug and accept when people gloss the narratives that we don't like, if we gloss the ones we do like, or we have to hold both sides to the same standard. And I just generally, having been on the wrong side of a lot of political causes while feeling I was the good guy, I've got a little bit bored of when they go low, we go high, because you just seem to get punched in the groin. Politically. And so, the whole Amazon, are the lungs of the planet. I think, box. It's not how trees work. But they are absolutely crucial to the current climate patterns. They are crucial to lots and lots of things that we care a lot about. And if it gets it further up the news to say 20% of our air comes there, can I kick off that much? My absolute personal least favorite statistic on the planet is this: 1 in 4 people will have some sort of mental health issue, either right now or at some point in their life. I've heard them used interchangeably in the same radio item with no one spotting a problem. No one's got a source for that. Totally made up. There's just an amazing chain of sourcing that you can chase back, I think, about 25, 30 years now. No one's come up with it. It's nonsense. I mean, who knows? There's a chance it's true. But, yeah. But do we need more or less awareness of what to do with mental health conditions, more or less compassion for people living with them, etc.? You know, is that the hill that I want to choose to die on? Maybe, but probably not. And I think sort of we do have to start to shrug off these sort of overstatements and broad things in the general narrative with stuff we don't like if we don't attack the ones on our side as much. Or we have to kind of go, you know what? The odds of actually putting the cork back on the bottle on a lot of these is essentially zero. So if there's a narrative that pushes something that's well evidenced, you know, am I helping myself? And there's a controversial one on this, which was used in some of the Ebola outbreaks a couple of years ago. And essentially, when they were training local staff kind of went, you'll get nowhere with this germ theory type stuff. Tell them that the bodies are haunted and they won't go near them for certain villages, for certain areas, for certain beliefs. And they decided that the greater good was to go with the explanations that would work and connect with local communities and be trusted by them, even if it didn't improve their overall understanding of medicine or science. And they said they think there are people alive and who complied with treatment and who helped because of that falsehood. I think they probably did the right thing. I'm not an expert, it's not for me to judge at all, but personally, in my gut, that feels right to me. I know a lot of people it doesn't to. But yeah, I think ultimately, if you look against these things, these overstatements, these zombie stats, you're not going to beat them, so join them.
Yeah, so James says, given the fact that don't work, tell them it's ghosts. What about you, Peter? Where do you stand on this?
In a surprising development. So I'm glad I finally disagree. So President Macron put out a photo, or whoever he employs to do it, I very much doubt he spends his time, put out a photo. Bolsonaro, who are you trying to convince? The point of this is that, so Macron put out his photo. It was an old photo of fires. Bolsonaro, therefore, is given an absolute free gift. He says, this is fake news, this was from years ago, this is not what's happening today, and so on. So because Macron's communicator was lazy and put out an old photo, Bolsonaro gets a free gift and is able to undercut the argument. Where people put out false claims, they're very often trying to generate interest in what is a serious situation. But if they put out what is the actual picture of the serious situation, that's enough. So Africa Check regularly fact-checks claims made around gender violence in South Africa. It's a hugely significant problem. There are wildly inflated statistics running around about it. And we regularly check those claims. At the time, and we got called out, and we went to a conference and we talked about this, and our team was called out and they said it's almost as if you're actually encouraging rape because you are diminishing, you're sort of undercutting the claims that we're making about how serious the problem is. So our team at the time was entirely made up of women. They were not actually advocates of rape. They were simply saying that, look, the statistics do not show what you're saying, and just because, yes, campaigns against gender violence are a worthy thing, you're doing no service by inflating these numbers. More than that, I think that in many ways, more than the nitty-gritty of whether the photo was taken this year or last year, or whether it's one every 36 seconds, one incidence of gender violence, that was the claim, every 36 seconds in South Africa, or every 3 minutes. Either of those statistics is horrific. But if you focus people's attention, if you focus the debate on what's the nitty-gritty picture on the ground, and then you can do that in a way that does become a narrative, you can then actually find solutions to the problem. And if I give you, so that example was that the conference we were at was in Cape Town. The meeting we were at was in Cape Town. And we'd looked at the rape statistics in Cape Town and correlated them with statistics around around public lighting. And you found, and there's no huge shock there, that a lot of the domestic violence and gender violence that takes place, there's a correlation between that and poor public lighting. So that then, from that, there flowed a debate around, well, if we actually want to tackle this, there's many things we need to do, but one of them is in these districts, in Khayelitsha and other parts of Cape Town, we need to tackle problems of public lighting as part of the solution. So by focusing that way on what's actually the matter, and you can push debate into a constructive into a constructive solution.
Having finally managed to find a point of disagreement, I realise we're strictly out of time, which is a terrible thing. But having promised you all this time you'll get a say, I do want to let a couple of people, if you would like, ask a question or make a point, and then we will have to wrap up because there is an award ceremony following. So if you would like to say anything or ask a question, stick your hand up sharpish and we'll get a microphone to you.
And we'll try and answer really quickly.
Really quickly.
No promises.
Oh, there's one right over there. That's because the microphone is at the far end of the room. There you go. Keep your hand up.
I like the...
You're right over there. I like the,
daisy
tag
chain
teaming.
system,
Yeah. We need a drone ready.
Okay, thanks. I saw a headline not very long ago, a few weeks ago, that President Trump has now passed the 10,000 lie threshold. And I believe that was a fact-checked observation by somebody, I don't know who. It seems to me there can't possibly be 10,000 things to lie about. And I doubt that President Trump would have the capacity to do that anyway. So my thought is there must be a lot less than 10,000 issues about which he's lying. And has there been any work on that to try and boil down these enormous numbers to something more reasonable about the real issues?
So, request to fact-check the fact-checkers. Let me just see if there's any other questions, because if there are, we'll take another one. Yes, no, conveniently close. Okay, there you go. I'll take you, and then I'll let you both come back very briefly, and then we must wind up.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to deepen your pessimism slightly.
Sorry, can you hold the microphone more like this?
I wanted to deepen your pessimism by sometimes those who have skepticism towards experts have a point. There's two things that remind me of this. There's economics, to use a dirty word in polite company, where medium-range forecasts for things like Brexit, some people consider them to be worthless anyway. And then there's the reproducibility crisis in science. Do these things feature in your thinking on this issue?
Okay, so the reproducibility problem in science and also skepticism in general, is that right? So yeah, we've strictly out of time. So if I can give you a minute each to answer both those questions and sum up all your thoughts, that'd be great.
So let's try that. No pressure. So on Trump stuff, yes, it is literally that he can do about 50 lies in about sort of 40 minutes. It's he says whatever suits him at the time. Like it's not even lying. A lie's consistent. He'll say whatever. But yes, obviously they categorize up hugely. And it's all sorts of stuff like other countries send their people. He literally doesn't understand how immigration works. It's all of that kind of stuff. I think the New York Times a couple of months ago had a pile-up of them by categories. And yeah, it comes down to about 300 major lies and then loads of sort of long tail. He's quite dreary with it, really. On the sort of skepticism of experts, yes, this is sort of the problem. If people are put too high on a platform and then you get to a realistic level, people are going to overcorrect and jump up. I mean, I really wish part of the, media's lack of faith in experts or the public's lack of faith in experts was a, spirited and sincere look at the replicated, I can't say it, you know what I mean, the replication crisis, yes. I would love that. That would be brilliant. I think part of the fact that we know about that is why we can have some trust in the system. People are looking for it, people are kicking for it, and things swing round and back. There's lots more we could do to improve academia, to improve experts, to improve publishing. I mean, academic publishing is insane. But, sorry, I've just seen who sponsors this. It's wonderful, insanely good. But the fact that people are trying to raise those questions from within the groups is a promising sign, is something that should encourage at least skepticism over experts, not cynicism. And that would be my overarching thing. Skepticism empowers you. Skepticism lets you have trust in systems and lets you have trust credibly. When we get cynical, when we give up on it, that's when everything falls apart. And so, I think we've got far too much cynicism and not nearly enough skepticism, and side pushes in that way.
Peter, your winding up thoughts.
Very quickly, the 10,000 lies, it's now about 11,000. It's the Washington Post, so there's a column called The Fact Checker in the Washington Post. It's run by a very nice chap called Glenn Kessler, and it's a database. You can parse it in many different ways, but it's all publicly, freely available. Are there reasons for skepticism? There are many, many reasons for skepticism. We could go into at much greater length. I have to say, working where Africa Check works, there are far greater reasons for skepticism than there are with the statistical pictures and data pictures that are presented in the UK. If I try, despite being a journalist by trade, to end on a note of optimism, 6 years ago, I took part in a meeting of the world's fact-checking organizations, and we went off to the pub, as one would, in 2 taxis at the end of the meeting. In June a couple of months ago, we had a meeting of 300 people, about 180 organizations in Cape Town. Fact check. There is indeed a problem of lack of trust. I don't believe this is the post-truth world that is one of the laziest headlines around. I think it's a post-trust world, and so there is a problem there. But there is also, and it's what James was saying, and I think in a sense, is that there are an awful lot of people who are pushing for ways to see a credible picture of the world we live in. And the fact that that is emerging in Kazakhstan, in Indonesia, in Argentina, in Venezuela, and where organizations are then partnering with community groups and social organizations and educational initiatives. There's an awful lot of initiatives. And it's not all since 2016, but that was quite a driver of it too.
There you go. So final thoughts. It's a post-trust world, so we need to build trust hand in hand with building skepticism. There is an appetite for truth out there, and if that doesn't work, tell them it's ghosts. Thank you very much to our 2 great speakers, James and Peter.